Hey everyone, I'm Ron De Jesus, Field Chief Privacy Officer at Transcend. The following is a conversation with Aimee Cardwell, Transcend's first ever Chief Information Security Officer in Residence and former CISO at UnitedHealth Group. We dive deep into the CPO-CISO dynamic, explore where there's tension, but also where we work well together. We also talk about how we each approach risk and how we balance implementation of privacy requirements versus technical trade-offs, and whether our roles are going to be converging in the future. I'm excited for you to hear about this important conversation with one of privacy's most important partners, security. This is Transcend Field Trips. Aimee, it's so amazing to meet Transcend's first ever Chief Information Security Officer in Residence. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, it's totally my pleasure. I'm excited to get to chat with you.
All the way from Rhode Island, which is, I learned from you just now,
Yes.
the only state that starts with the letter R.
And it's the smallest.
Smallest too. I'm excited to have this conversation because, as you know, privacy and security are incredibly intertwined. Obviously, on a Venn diagram of things, there's lots of commonalities, but we focus on different things. You're one of my biggest partners in-house. So I think this is a really important conversation that we're going to have.
For sure. And I'm really looking forward to it, especially the ways that we should be intersecting that sometimes isn't obvious.
So let's dive into exactly the crux of the issue, which is our dynamic.
Yeah.
I've been a chief privacy officer for about 4 years. And I actually at one point reported up to the CISO. So lots of experience engaging with my security counterparts. How would you specifically characterize the CPO-CISO relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's different in every company. And, in some cases, I think that's because some companies deal with more sensitive data than others. And, I have a couple of different clients and some of them, their data just isn't that sensitive. So it's not as big of a deal. But in a heavily regulated industry, I would say it works best when we work together really closely. It doesn't matter to me so much the reporting relationship, although I suspect that it's probably better to have us be on equal footing in the organization. But it doesn't matter, for instance, if you would report up to the chief legal officer and I might report up to the CIO.
Sure.
As long as we're seen as peers and we see each other as peers.
100%. I also think that there might be a little bit, I've experienced tension in some of my roles simply because traditionally we don't have as much budget as you guys, right? We're not, and I'm speaking for myself, but we're not experienced buyers of technology, right? You guys are incredibly experienced. You buy technology, you have the budget. How do you have these conversations with your peers who are CPOs who might not have the same resources that you do?
Yeah, so if I was being less charitable, I would say if I partner with a CPO, I can increase my budget by getting the things that we both need to do done. If I don't partner with the CPO, the CPO not only isn't used to buying technology, but also isn't familiar with the way to get technology things done in the company.
Right.
So it's not just about the budget, but also about the how do you get work done in tech.
Sure.
But if we partner, so if we don't partner, we might be competing, trying to do the same thing with two different tools. If we do partner, we can probably both get what we want for less money for both of us.
I 100% agree. There's also that old adage where essentially saying that you can have security without privacy, but you can't have privacy without security. And I think to a certain degree, that's true. Obviously, we can put as many policies and procedures in place as we want, but if the data is not secure, it's basically a failure of the business. But I was wondering, are there other ways in which we as CPOs and privacy leaders enhance your work as a CISO? Do we, how do we actually contribute to the role that you play?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll answer it in 1 second, but because you said something that ticks off a thought for me. One of the things I learned when I became a CISO was that if you put a policy in place before you're actually prepared to enforce the policy, you've essentially put yourself out of compliance immediately. And so one of the ways I love to work together with my chief privacy officer is to determine what we want to do and then sort of plan out how we're going to get there from here. because ultimately I want it to end with us creating a policy. But before we create the policy, we need to figure out how we're going to get to the state that the policy outlines. And for me, that's a great place for us to start planning together. We can talk about budget. We can talk about whether we have the right software. But more importantly, we can agree on what we're going to do this year together.
When we talk about kind of focus areas, obviously day to day, I'm reading the next state privacy law. I'm making sure that my privacy policy is up to date. I'm also thinking about like data in different ways. For example, I'm thinking about, do we actually need that personal information to begin with? What's the purposes for collection? What's the need to retain it for X number of years?
Sure.
How are you thinking about data specifically from the CISO perspective?
I really think of data as a big target, and the less of it we have, the better. So
we align there then.
Right. So when you talk about data retention policy, my heart is beating faster. I really want to clear out as much data as possible, both because it creates a smaller target for threat actors, but also because it creates a smaller target for litigation. And this is one of the reasons why I think privacy folks generally roll up into legal, because those litigation holds are just as important as the ability to delete and take care of the other data.
I agree. And I love that you share the same perspective that the least or the less data that you collect, the lower the risk exposure. That's exactly true.
It's even more true in the age of AI, of course, because when you have leftover data that's sort of sitting around in databases that you weren't aware of, someone sooner or later is going to use that to train a model. And now you're training a model with data that you no longer have the right to own.
So that's a great segue into the question that I had, which was around how do we balance this need for data to train our AI models versus this whole concept of purpose limitation and making sure that we respect consumer choices. Have you ever had difficult conversations around, your product teams that say, hey, we need X terabytes of data to train, but I'm pushing back as a CPO and saying, is that really true? Yeah. Are you having those conversations as well? Or?
I am. And I hope you're going to like this answer. I try to de-identify the data as often as possible. My sense is that you can de-identify the data in the vast majority of cases and get the same output from your model. Really, it's as easy as changing the street address and the zip code and removing the phone number, for example, so that you can still understand this is where I'll use the word patients or customers reside, and this is what their behavior was. But it doesn't have to be the exact customer. So for me, de-identification is the best way to achieve that.
That's a great point. I wanted to go back quickly, Aimee, to the conversation around risk and risk appetite. As a CPO, I'm looking at a variety of different dimensions, whether that be reputational risk, exposure to regulatory scrutiny. What's our consumer going to think? Do you look at risk from the same lens as well? Or are you kind of more looking at it from, how is this going to impact us technically? Or again, what sort of dimensions are you looking specifically at risk from?
Yeah, all of the above. So I want to put data in places where we have control over it and try not to spread it out over 15 or 20 or sometimes 100 different databases, because then the cleanup's just nearly impossible.
Right.
But I am also thinking about what's the business trying to achieve and what's the, I hate to use the word safest, but what's the best path for us to achieve that doesn't eliminate risk, because we can't do that.
We're never going to eliminate risk.
Exactly. Right. But that minimizes it, and that I can contextualize the risk for the executive team and say, here's where we're taking a risk. This is what we could do about that. Are we all in agreement?
Right. Speaking of risk, I think, one of the things that, at least from my experience, presents the most risk is data deletion and also vendor risk management.
Yeah.
From a CPO's perspective, I think, here's a story. When I first started in tech, and this was pre-GDPR. This is like a couple months before GDPR, where the data deletion requirement came into play.
Yeah.
And I had a conversation with our engineering team saying, hey, can you operationalize data deletion? Tell me how we can delete consumer data. And they came back with a lot of, interesting questions, which at the time I wouldn't have really thought of as a CPO. For example, Ron, does that mean deleting it from cold storage?
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean, what if I pseudonymize or anonymize the data? Does it actually fulfill the legal requirement? Mm. When you work with CPOs who, again, have more of a legal bent, how do you engage them to understand what the technical trade-offs are with respect to data deletion or, rights of access, that sort of thing?
Yeah, and those are the same sorts of questions that I would ask. Honestly, that's how I would engage. Okay. I would say, what's the requirement? Great. Does this meet the requirement? What about this kind of data? What about that kind of data?
Right.
And often the answers to those questions aren't straightforward, and we need to both go away into our separate offices and think about that for a while and then come back together and keep building on the solution until we find something that's mutually acceptable. And possible, frankly, because there are lots of solutions you and I could come up with that the tech team would be like, yeah, we're not doing that.
I remember a conversation I had with a technical team saying, and being naive at the time, saying, why can't we pseudonymize or anonymize or encrypt all this data anyway? And I had no concept of technical debt or, technical trade-offs around doing that. Yeah. So, it took me a while, and I was really glad that I was thrown into the deep end working with technical folks.
It just makes you stronger.
It really does. Similar risk or similar area of high risk would be vendor management. From a privacy professional's perspective, we're typically looking at contractual requirements. Can this, vendor fulfill their GDPR or CCPA or whatever it is requirements? How are you looking at vendor risk as a CISO?
I'm not going to lie. Vendor risk management, in my opinion, is one of the weakest areas of most CISOs' portfolios.
Yeah.
And the reason is because just what you said, we rely on contractual requirements and legal requirements, and that just feels so insufficient. If I write you a paper that says, you're going to give me your driver's license, and I'm going to just write you a paper that says, I promise not to lose it. It doesn't feel very good, does it? Because I can still lose it, in which case I owe you $50. Like, what is it? It's just very weak. So I also try to use the principle of least data with vendors. Sometimes it's easy because, I've got an API that gives all of this data. Yes, but I don't want to share all of that data with the vendor. Right. Can I convert them into a token, that data into a token, and share just the token with the vendor? And then, or can I enable the vendor to look up one customer at a time as needed? So what are the processes that I can use to minimize the data that I share?
I love that you are curious and that you explore different ways in which data can be provided, but securely. I think that's great. I think we also, as CPOs, it's our job to push back.
Yeah.
If a vendor doesn't need, all the information that we typically could provide them, let's have that conversation. And I think that's something as compliance professionals that we need to kind of push day to day.
Like you, I try to think of it also from not just the company's perspective, but the end user, the customer's perspective.
Right.
So if the customer knew that I was sending all of their data to some other vendor, and then that vendor gets hit by a threat actor, I'm still responsible. And the customer doesn't think the other guy's responsible.
Right.
I'm sure you've gotten a notice in the mail and you're like, I don't do business with this company. I don't know who they are. That doesn't feel very good.
100%. Similarly, with respect to M&A, so mergers and acquisitions, I'm looking at risk from the perspective of, would this potential acquisition introduce risk to our organization, whether that be, perhaps they might have been subject to an FTC consent decree. Perhaps they experience a really large breach of customer data. What types of questions are you asking potential M&A transactions?
Here's a place where we might actually come at this from a different angle.
Yeah.
I don't assume that I have the no vote on any M&A transaction. So maybe it's the history of my career as a CIO, because you can't just say no to the business when they say, build me a new thing. I assume that the M&A transaction is going to go through. And so instead of saying, what about, how are they, what are they doing? I say, how can I secure them before we get them? And then how can I further secure them after we get them? It's up to the business to make the decision as to whether or not they want to buy the company. And all I can do is make sure that we're bringing them in as securely as possible.
I love that perspective.
Yeah.
Having this, being forward thinking and saying this is actually a risk that is potentially going to impact our business.
Yeah. I'm sure you've heard that CISOs are sometimes seen as the department of no. This is part of me changing that, because it would normally, and in fact, my predecessor would have said, oh, well, this company is really risky. I don't recommend you buy them. And then they just stop asking. So I don't want the business to stop asking. I want them to start asking.
I truly did not know that you shared that same moniker. We are known as the Department of No. So I'm glad
we really are partners.
We're two peas in a pod. That's really interesting. Wanted to switch quickly, Aimee, to AI. Mm-hmm. We can't have a conversation between CPO and CISO without AI. I actually met last year with a couple of members of the European Parliament who were responsible for the AI Act, who were heavily engaged. And one of the questions I asked them was, who do you think in the compliance org is best suited to handle AI governance? And maybe I led them with this answer a little bit, but they did at some point kind of agree that it was the chief privacy officer, subject to us increasing our expertise technically, also around different aspects of AI governance, whether that's bias identification, understanding the exact models. Let me ask that question of you. Who do you think is best suited to address AI governance kind of generally within a company? And again, I've been told it's the CPO, but I wanted your thoughts.
For a large enterprise, I would actually hire an AI czar. Okay. I would hire a single leader who is responsible for AI. And that person is likely to have a fairly robust team because they need to understand where AI is being used across the enterprise.
Sure.
And if they think about it the way I do, there's one whole set of AI work that is almost unregulated. Sort of, if it's public anyway, if it's a job description or marketing materials or whatever, go nuts, because you want to enable as much experimentation in the company as you can. You really want to. You don't want the company to fall behind because you're limiting people's use of AI.
Right.
But then there's that secondary layer, which is company confidential or sensitive information. And that's the place where you need to understand which AI companies do we have contracts with, where do we train models, where do we not train models, et cetera. So for me, for a large enterprise, it's its own gig.
Point taken. Do you think that there are instances where a CISO could be primed to be that AI czar? Or is it, again, something that you would kind of outsource as its own kind of FTE?
Again, in a large enterprise, which is where most of my experience is, CISO's got a pretty big job already.
Yeah.
My team at UnitedHealth Group was 1,200 people and $300 million budget. So adding AI on top of that, it's not going to get the level of focus that I think it could. Just like we have a chief data officer, for me, a chief AI officer is not an unusual role.
I'm glad to hear you say this because out in the CPO community, we are being given that AI governance hat, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the times executive teams or leaders do think that we're the best suited to handle that, given our role identifying risk with respect to data, but also understanding how consumers and regulators and the general public are going to perceive these types of projects. But I am actually really glad that you said that it does warrant, depending on the company, its own role and FTE.
Let me offer to you just the idea that, when you talk about how you keep up with all of the different regulation and legislation that's happening across the world, as a CISO, I'm like, better you than me. But think about the AI person. So he or she isn't going to be able to do that while also keeping up with AI. Just like I can't do really great security. Like, it's just a lot. So I think if we each have we stick to our own knitting and work together as a really tight-knit team, I feel like we'll have a really strong definition of responsibility that way.
What is the one piece of advice you'd give to CPOs or other privacy professionals that want to work best with their CISO? Is there something that Obviously I imagine that you've worked with a lot of CPOs in your illustrious career, Aimee. But give me a couple of tidbits of guidance for, a CPO that might not have yet engaged with their CISO.
Yeah, that's a great one. So I think always going in with the idea that you're on the same team is the
100%.
first place to start. If you and I were just meeting at a company, I would really try to listen and ask questions about what you and your team are trying to achieve. Especially, I'd like to ask around the places where you don't feel like you're succeeding right now. And I would devote the first couple of instances of us working together to me trying to clear those roadblocks for you in order to establish trust. And once you and I feel like we have a good, solid working relationship, that will really work out well when, for instance, we have an incident that we have to work on together.
Right.
So the faster we can work together and prove that we're shoulder to shoulder and not nose to nose, the better off the company's going to be. And frankly, the better we're both going to look in the organization.
100%. I tell my husband that all the time when we're fighting. We're on the same team, Blake. So that's really, really great advice. Aimee, I want to talk a little bit about the great company that we work for, Transcend. What drew you to this role? It's an incredibly unique role, first of its kind. I'm so glad you're here with me, actually navigating what this, I'm the first field CPO, and I think this partnership is just truly invaluable. But what drew you to Transcend specifically? Talk to me about that.
Yeah, when I started exploring the way Transcend works, it blew my mind. It was the best solution I'd ever seen. Specifically, I'm referring to the fact that they make integrations with pretty much every data store that a large enterprise might have. And if you do it that way and you need to delete a piece of data, you can do it with one single command and touch up to 200 different data stores. For me, that was game-changing and something that I really wanted to promote and frankly be a part of.
Awesome. I have one last question for you, Aimee.
Sure.
And I've heard this in conference circles. Do you think in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years, that our roles are going to fully converge?
I don't think so. I'll be honest, your role is very full and you're in a lot of legal and regulatory discussions that I'm not a part of and frankly don't have the expertise for. And there's a whole side of my world that you don't interact with at all, like threat hunting or daily alerts that we take care of. And so I feel like we've both got rich enough and full enough jobs. Yeah. It'd be a tough role for one person.
100% agree. You can keep the threat hunting on your side while I look at logs.
You can keep the legal on your side.
Agreed, 100%. Well, Aimee, this was so incredibly, I think engaging, and I'm so happy to be able to share your insights with the CPO community. I think they're going to really enjoy this conversation.
Oh, I value your partnership so much. Security and privacy, 2 peas in a pod, like you said.
2 peas in a pod.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Aimee.